Manhattan, Upper East Side, the Mitchell Penthouse, a May afternoon that would change two lives forever. Katherine Mitchell, 42 years old with a fortune of $200 million, pretended to sleep in her leather chair while Jacob, the 8-year-old son of her janitor, entered quietly believing she was asleep. The boy approached the open safe containing $4 million in cash, diamonds worth $7 million, and documents worth an empire. Katherine watched through barely open eyelids, ready to discover if her most trusted employee's son was a thief or honest. But what she saw chilled her to the bone. Jacob didn't touch a single bill. Instead, he pulled an envelope from his small backpack and placed it inside the safe. It contained $30,000 in bloodstained cash and a letter that began, "Ms. Mitchell, my dad is dying and doesn't know I discovered his secret. Please save him and me before it's too late. Cinder." When Katherine opened her eyes and read the complete letter, she discovered that the janitor she considered like a brother was being blackmailed to save Jacob from a terrible truth. He wasn't his son, but the kidnapped child from 8 years ago of one of America's most powerful families. Katherine Mitchell had learned early that trust was a luxury a millionaire couldn't afford. 42 years old, self-made woman who'd built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing, she'd seen too many betrayals to still believe in human goodness. The Upper East Side penthouse, 4,000 square feet of understated luxury spanning 2 floors, was her fortress, where she constantly tested the loyalty of those around her. Robert Thompson had worked as the building's janitor for 15 years, a 60-year-old man, honest to his core, or so Katherine had always believed. Widowed for 10 years, he was raising alone Jacob, an 8-year-old boy with eyes too intelligent for his age, and an underlying sadness that even the brightest smiles couldn't completely hide. The test was simple in its cruelty. Katherine had left her office safe apparently open by mistake, containing $4 million in cash divided into $10,000 bundles, certified diamonds worth $7 million, and corporate documents worth the entire Mitchell empire. She'd then settled into the Eames chair to appear deeply asleep, but with a perfect viewing angle through her lashes. She'd already tested 3 housekeepers this way, 2 fired for stealing, 1 promoted for honesty, 2 drivers, even the doorman. It was Jacob's turn, who every afternoon after school spent an hour in the office while his father finished his shift. Katherine had always wondered if the boy's innocence was genuine, or a mask taught by his father. Jacob entered at 4:32 p.m. precisely, as every day. He still wore his public school uniform from the Bronx, navy pants and white shirt with some ink stains. He moved with the caution of someone who'd learned that making noise in rich people's homes was a capital sin. He set his backpack near the door and approached the desk where he usually did his homework. That's when he noticed the open safe. Katherine held her breath, every muscle tense in anticipation. The boy approached slowly, eyes wide at wealth he'd probably never seen concentrated in one place. His small hands trembled slightly, but instead of reaching for the money, Jacob looked around in terror. He verified that Katherine was really asleep, then did something completely unexpected. He opened his faded blue backpack and extracted a thick manila envelope. With frantic movements, he stuffed it between the bundles of bills, trying to hide it as deep as possible in the safe. Katherine felt her heart accelerate. She hadn't expected this. The boy moved away from the safe as if it burned, returned to the desk and began doing homework with forced concentration that betrayed his nervousness. His hands shook as he wrote. After 20 minutes of torture, Katherine pretended to wake with a theatrical yawn. Jacob jumped in his chair, his face going from white to red in a second. She stood up, stretching, noting from the corner of her eye how the boy threw terrified glances toward the still open safe. She let him leave with his father at 5:30 p.m., as always. Then she rushed to the safe. The manila envelope was hidden under 3 bundles of bills. She opened it with hands that now truly trembled. Inside were $30,000 in small bills, some stained with what looked like dried blood, and a letter written in the uncertain handwriting of an 8-year-old. Katherine's hands trembled as she read Jacob's letter. The childish handwriting made the content even more heartbreaking. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, my name is Jacob, but I don't know my real name. Dad Robert is dying. He has cancer. He hasn't told me, but I heard the doctor. He has no money for treatment because all his savings go to pay the bad man who comes every month. The bad man knows I'm not Dad Robert's real son. He says if Dad doesn't pay, he'll tell the police Dad kidnapped me. But Dad didn't kidnap me. He saved me. 8 years ago, he found me in a dumpster near Mount Sinai Hospital, wrapped in a cashmere blanket with a gold pin shaped like an eagle. I was dying from cold. Dad took me and raised me as his son because his wife had just died, and he says I was a gift from heaven. But the bad man found out everything, and now Dad gives him all the money he earns and more. I stole this money from the bad man while he was drunk asleep. I know stealing is wrong, but Dad is dying and I don't know what to do. You're the only good person I know. Please help Dad. I don't want to be alone. Jacob." Katherine had to sit down. The eagle-shaped pin, she'd seen an identical one years before, on the lapel of Elizabeth Harrison, wife of the most powerful tech mogul in Silicon Valley. Their son had disappeared 8 years ago, at 6 months old. Kidnapped, they said, though the body was never found. The Harrisons had offered $20 million reward, but nothing. She ran to her computer and searched the online archives. There it was. November 2015. Disappearance of Michael Harrison. 6 months. Kidnapped from his crib while the nanny slept. Distinguishing marks. A crescent-shaped birthmark on his right wrist. She looked at photos of the missing baby, and her heart stopped. The same green eyes as Jacob. The same dimple in his chin. But why hadn't Robert reported finding him? The answer was in the letter. He'd just lost his wife, was destroyed by grief. An abandoned baby must have truly seemed like a sign from destiny. And then, as time passed, how could he explain 8 years of silence? The blackmailer must have discovered the truth somehow. Katherine knew that type of parasite. They sucked blood until the last drop, then destroyed their victims anyway. Robert was dying of cancer, aggravated by stress and malnutrition from paying the blackmail. Jacob would end up who knows where. Katherine made a decision. She called her most trusted private investigator, Michael Stone, former FBI with contacts everywhere. She arranged an immediate meeting. Meanwhile, she put Robert and Jacob under discreet surveillance. She had to move carefully. One false step, and both Robert and Jacob would be destroyed. The janitor would end up in prison for kidnapping, Jacob in trauma from which he'd never recover. That night, Katherine didn't sleep. She kept seeing Jacob's face as he hid that blood-stained money in her safe, the desperate gesture of a boy trying to save the only father he'd ever known. And Robert, the man she'd always considered the most honest in the world, who was letting himself die to protect a boy who wasn't even his. Michael Stone took only 3 days to identify the blackmailer. His name was Tony Valdez, with a record for extortion, robbery, drug dealing. But the most shocking discovery was another. Valdez had been the Harrisons' driver 8 years before. Fired months before the kidnapping for theft, he'd probably orchestrated everything for revenge and money. But something had gone wrong. Instead of demanding ransom, he'd abandoned the baby, perhaps frightened by the enormous media pressure. Now, by pure chance, he'd recognized in Jacob the kidnapped child and found in Robert the golden goose, a terrified man who paid without asking questions. Katherine studied the dossier Michael had brought. Valdez lived in a run-down studio in the South Bronx, spent everything on alcohol and gambling. He went to Robert every first of the month to collect $5,000, everything the poor janitor could scrape together between salary, loans, and small thefts, that Jacob did to help him without his knowledge. Katherine's plan was risky, but necessary. She had to neutralize Valdez, save Robert from kidnapping charges, and above all protect Jacob from the trauma of discovering the truth. But there was a problem: the Harrisons. Elizabeth Harrison was known for her ruthlessness in business and life. If she discovered her baby had been raised for 8 years by a janitor, she'd destroy Robert without mercy. On the evening of May 31st, Katherine put her plan into action. She knew Valdez would go to Robert the next day for the monthly collection. She had the blackmailer followed and discovered that the night before collections, he always got drunk at the same bar in the Bronx. Michael and 2 of his men were waiting. Meanwhile, Katherine summoned Robert to her office. The man entered dragging his feet, a shadow of what he'd been. Cancer and stress had reduced him to a walking skeleton. When he saw the open safe and the manila envelope on the desk, his legs gave out. Katherine sat him down, poured him a scotch that Robert drank with trembling hands. Then, calmly, she told him everything she knew. Robert collapsed, crying as he hadn't even when his wife died. He told his version. That November night, returning from the night shift at the hospital where he worked before, he'd heard crying. The baby was in the dumpster, already blue from cold. He'd taken him instinctively, warmed him, saved him. He was going to take him to the police the next day, he swore. But when he'd returned home with that little life in his arms, to the empty house where his wife's perfume still lingered after a week, something had broken and reformed in him. It was a sign.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
It had to be. Mary, his wife, had sent him an angel to keep him from dying of grief. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. He'd forged documents, passing him off as the son of a dead cousin. Then Jacob had started calling him Dad, and fate was sealed. He couldn't lose him anymore. He'd become his reason for living, had saved him from the abyss of depression. While Robert confessed, Michael called. Valdez had been caught with overwhelming evidence: recordings of extortions, photos while collecting money, testimonies. But he'd sung something even more shocking. He hadn't kidnapped Michael Harrison. He'd found him already in the dumpster that night, put there by someone else. He'd seen Robert take him, and had waited 8 years to exploit the information. But who had abandoned the baby? Katherine began digging into the Harrisons' life. What she discovered left her breathless. Elizabeth Harrison had been having an affair for years. Michael's real father wasn't her husband, but her lover. When her husband started suspecting and demanded a paternity test, Elizabeth had staged the kidnapping. The evidence was in the bank records. A payment of $200,000 to an Albanian criminal the day before the kidnapping. The man had been found dead a week later in a gang settlement, taking the secret to his grave. Elizabeth had the baby abandoned, thinking she'd retrieve him after a few days, when her husband was convinced of the kidnapping. But Robert had found him first. Katherine now had a nuclear weapon. She summoned the Harrisons with a business excuse. When they arrived at the Penthouse, she seated them in the office. Then, without preamble, she laid the evidence on the table. Elizabeth's face went from haughty to terrified in a second. Her husband, James Harrison, seemed to age 10 years as he realized the truth. Katherine proposed a deal. The Harrisons would recognize having found their son raised lovingly by an adoptive family who'd saved him. No charges against Robert, who'd be presented as a hero. In exchange, total silence about the real responsibilities. Jacob could choose if and when to meet his biological parents, but Robert would remain his legal father. Elizabeth wanted to refuse, but James, destroyed by discovering the betrayal and deception, accepted. In fact, he went further. He allocated $10 million for Robert's treatment and a trust fund for Jacob. He wanted the innocent child to have everything, except a mother who'd thrown him away like trash. Robert's treatment began immediately at Memorial Sloan Kettering, the best cancer center in New York. The cancer was advanced, but not yet terminal. With the right therapies, and without the stress of blackmail, doctors gave good hope. Katherine paid everything from her own pocket, refusing the Harrisons' money, which she considered dirty. The problem now was Jacob. The boy had to know something, but how much? Katherine, Robert, and a child psychologist decided on a partial truth. Jacob would know he was adopted, saved by Robert, who'd found him abandoned, but nothing about the Harrisons until he was older. The conversation happened on a Sunday in June in Central Park. Robert, already improved after the first treatments, held Jacob's hand while telling him the sweetened truth. The boy listened in silence, his green eyes getting bigger and bigger. When Robert finished, terrified the boy would reject him, Jacob did something unexpected. He stood up, walked around the bench, and hugged Robert so tight the man feared he'd hurt himself. "You're my real dad," he said firmly. "You saved me. You loved me. Real parents are the ones who love you, not the ones who make you." Katherine had to turn away to hide her tears. This 8-year-old boy had more wisdom than all the adults she knew. When she returned, Jacob looked at her with those two intelligent eyes and said, "I know you helped us, Ms. Mitchell. I saw Dad's new medicines. Thank you." From that day, something changed in the penthouse. Jacob continued coming every afternoon, but now it was different. Katherine began helping him with homework, discovering a brilliant mind that public school wasn't valuing enough. Robert, increasingly stronger, worked with renewed energy, grateful beyond words. One evening, while Jacob drew and Robert finished his shift, Katherine made a decision. She called her lawyer and began the paperwork to establish a full scholarship for Jacob at the best schools in Manhattan. But there was more. She was also considering legally adopting both Robert and Jacob. She had no family. They'd become hers. The Harrisons remained in the shadows, respecting the agreement. James had divorced Elizabeth and moved to London. Elizabeth lived in her golden prison, knowing her son was alive but unreachable. Perfect punishment for a mother who'd chosen appearance over substance. A year later, the Mitchell penthouse was unrecognizable. Not in appearance, still elegant and luxurious, but in atmosphere. A boy's laughter echoed in the halls, colorful drawings decorated the office next to million-dollar paintings, and the smell of Sunday pot roast had replaced the antiseptic smell of emptiness. Robert was in complete remission. The cancer, caught in time and properly treated, had been defeated. But the real healing had been in his soul. Freed from the weight of secrets and blackmail, he was reborn. He continued as janitor, but now was much more. He was the butler, the trusted man, the adoptive grandfather Katherine had never had. Jacob attended the Dalton School with a full scholarship. He was first in his class, already spoke 3 languages, played violin. But above all, he remained the sweet, wise boy who'd hidden blood-stained money to save his father. Every afternoon he returned to the penthouse, did homework in the office while Katherine worked, and they'd established a ritual. At 5 o'clock sharp, snack together, and chess game. It was during one of these games that Jacob, now 9, asked the question Katherine both feared and hoped for. "Aunt Katherine," he'd started calling her that, "you have no family. Dad has no one but me. I don't have a mom. Why don't we become a real family?" Katherine looked at Robert, who was polishing silverware, pretending not to listen but with ears perked. The 2 adults exchanged a look loaded with meaning. It was what all 3 wanted, but no one had the courage to say. "It would be complicated," Katherine said cautiously. "I'm your legal guardian along with Dad Robert, but a formal adoption." "The Harrisons," Jacob said suddenly, freezing both adults' blood. "I know who they are. I've always known. I'm not stupid. I saw how that blonde lady looked at me at the grocery store. Always from afar. Always with sad eyes. I researched online. I know she's my biological mother. I also know she abandoned me." The silence in the room was deafening. Jacob continued, with maturity impossible for his age. "But I don't care. She threw me away. Dad Robert saved me. You, Aunt Catherine, gave me a future. You're my family. If we need the Harrisons' permission for adoption, let's go ask for it. But I want to be Jacob Thompson Mitchell. 2 weeks later, in a lawyer's office in Midtown Manhattan, the meeting happened. Elizabeth Harrison, aged 10 years in one, signed the documents relinquishing parental rights with a trembling hand. Before leaving, she asked to say something to Jacob. The boy nodded. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth whispered. "One day, perhaps, you'll understand. Love sometimes isn't enough, but I'm happy you found those who truly love you." Jacob looked at her with those green eyes that were the only thing they had in common, and replied, "I'm happy too, and one day, perhaps, I'll forgive you. But that day isn't today." On September 15th, before a judge in Manhattan Family Court, Katherine Mitchell officially adopted Jacob Thompson, with the consent and co-guardianship of Robert Thompson. For the first time in her life, Katherine had a family. Not a blood family, but a chosen family, forged in pain and cemented in love. The evening of the ruling, in the penthouse that was now home, the three dined together as they'd been doing for months. Robert had cooked his famous beef stew. Jacob had set the table with the good china. Katherine had opened a bottle of 1998 Chateau Margaux, Jacob's birth year. During the toast, Jacob with grape juice, Katherine thought back to that afternoon a year before, when she'd pretended to sleep to test a boy's honesty. She'd looked for a thief and found an angel. She'd wanted to unmask dishonesty and discovered a hero. She'd lived 42 years building walls of distrust, and an 8-year-old boy had torn them down with an envelope full of blood-stained money and a plea for help. "To family," she said, raising her glass. "To the family we choose," Jacob corrected. "To the family that chooses us," Robert concluded. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered in the night. Somewhere in that city, Elizabeth Harrison cried for the son she'd lost by her own choice. Tony Valdez rotted in prison. But in the Upper East Side penthouse, 3 souls that fate had united in an impossible way dined together, laughed together, were together. The safe in the office remained always open now. There was no more need for tests, pretenses, simulated sleep. There was trust, the real kind, the kind that isn't bought with 200 million, but earned with desperate gestures of brave boys, with silent sacrifices of adoptive fathers, with hearts of millionaires who learn that true wealth isn't counted in dollars. Jacob had hidden $30,000 blood-stained dollars in that safe to save his father. In exchange, he'd found 2 parents, a home, a future. And he'd taught a cynical millionaire that there are still people for whom love is worth more than money, for whom family isn't a matter of DNA, but dedication. The last scene the staff remember from that evening is this: Katherine teaching Jacob a new chess opening, Robert dozing in the armchair with the newspaper, and the open safe no longer guarding secrets, but holding the photo of the 3 of them embracing on adoption day. Because true riches aren't hidden in safes. They sit at table with us, call us dad even if we're not by blood, save us when we pretend to sleep, but are really dying of loneliness. And Katherine Mitchell, who'd spent her life testing others' honesty, had learned the most important lesson. Sometimes pretending to sleep really wakes you up. And sometimes a boy who hides money instead of stealing it can teach you that true wealth is having someone to risk everything for. Someone who calls you dad even if you're not. Someone who transforms an empty penthouse into a home full of love. The safe that had been a test became a symbol, from locked and monitored to always open, from hiding wealth to displaying the only photo that mattered. Because Katherine had discovered that the greatest treasures don't have price tags, they have heartbeats. And sometimes they come in the form of 8-year-old boys who would rather save a dying janitor than steal millions, who choose love over blood, who teach billionaires that money is just paper, but family is everything. Hit like if you believe family is chosen by the heart, not blood. Comment with the moment that touched you most. Share with someone who needs to know that honesty and love are worth more than all the money in the world. Subscribe for more stories that prove destiny unites souls that belong together.